they're not treating us real well. There's like an anti-family, anti-woman type of sentiment out there.
To lose unionism would be to go back to the days that were worse than slavery.
Our kids have nowhere to go. They're always out in the street. You know, they have nowhere to go. Nowhere.
We are angry, capital A, at the injustice that we still see.
The very nature of the workplace has changed. It used to be that if you graduated from high school, you would go find a company that you wanted to work for, and maybe it was a company that your father or your mother worked for. That's not what it's like anymore.
Hello, I'm Doris McMillan. Back in 1972, a small group of women office workers in Cambridge, Massachusetts got fed up. They were tired of being overlooked and underpaid. When they started talking to other office workers, they discovered they had strength in numbers and decided to organize. For financial help, they turned to the Campaign for Human Development, a new action arm of the United States Catholic bishops who were willing to take a chance on people organizing themselves for justice. What resulted was not just another union, but a movement. Its name you may recognize from the movie and TV show it inspired. Now, meet the originals of 9 to 5. Founder, Karen Nussbaum.
9 to 5 is an organization that represents women, but all kinds of women. We are a thoroughly integrated organization by race, and that's a very important part of who 9 to 5 is. The business of 9 to 5 is to teach people that the best way to make a change is working with other people, that you just can't do it on your own. Probably the most important thing we provide for our members is a hotline.
9 to 5's national hotline. This is Sharon.
You know, I talk to a lot of working women all the time, but I was surprised at the number of people who call up because they've been fired because they were pregnant. This is illegal. You're not supposed to be fired because you're pregnant, or that they are being demoted systematically because of their age. The kinds of things that are patently illegal are happening day after day.
During the taping, I have them where they're electing one woman out of 25 to call the hotline. That's great stuff. That's real good stuff. And they're all standing there behind her while she's calling me from a pay phone during her lunch hour. 7 months. Okay, so you'd have to put you on medical disability leave when you were 7 months. A lot of times, a woman will be at a company for like 9, 10 years, and her performance has been good. She's done fairly well for herself. She's been a good, dedicated employee. She comes in, she's real happy. She's going to have a baby. She comes in and tells everybody and figures they're going to be happy for her, too. She comes up for her next review, say in 3 or 4 more months, all of a sudden, her evaluations start going down. She's had a good record with the company for 9, 10 years, and all of a sudden her performance isn't any good anymore.
Because my job told me, even after they knew that I was going out due to doctor's orders, that I still could not get this disability.
Well, they may be in violation of the Pregnancy Disability Act of 1978, which clearly states that pregnancy disability is to be treated no differently than any other medical disability.
The workplace has changed, and so we now have surveillance and control instead of supervision and training. It's one thing to have a supervisor, but to have your supervisor sitting in your lap 8 hours a day, reporting on how many keystrokes you're getting per minute, whether you've taken a break, how long you spent in the bathroom, whether you made a personal call. That's what it's like for increasing numbers of working people today. Ultimately, what has to happen is that the workplace has to change. It has to be better to go to work every day in the morning. The workplace will change because people will go into work and will demand it. We will act differently. We will change the culture, and employers will have to respond to that.
Karen Nussbaum would probably be surprised to be called a modern-day prophet, although she is not afraid to speak out against injustice. She would be even more surprised to learn that her organization, which has no religious affiliation, is part of a tradition called Catholic social teaching. What is this tradition?
It's a set of ideas, it's a tradition of thought, and it's called action. And over the last 100 years, this church has been exploring with increased urgency what it means to be Christian and what are the social demands of being a Christian in a world of increasing urbanization, industrialization, in a world facing questions of war and peace and economic justice.
Although the roots of this tradition go back to the Old Testament, Catholic social teaching officially began 100 years ago. In 1889, John Philip Sousa wrote the Semper Fidelis March, which captured the optimism of young America, still a new nation at the age of 100. The Internationale was also written that year in Europe. It was to become the rallying song of socialists around the world for the next 100 years. The most popular song of the era, written the same year, seems in retrospect to have foreseen the future. After the ball is over, for life was never to be the same again, for rich or poor. According to the 1890 census, the average work week in the manufacturing industries was 60 to 70 hours a week. For this, the average man earned $9.40. At the turn of the century, less than 1/2% of the population controlled 70% of the nation's wealth, and they justified their power in the name of God and science, expressed in a philosophy called social Darwinism. Reverend Russell Conwell, founder of Temple University.
There is not a poor person in the United States who was not made poor by his own shortcomings.
Andrew Carnegie.
While the law of nature may sometimes be hard for the individual, it is for the good of the race, because it ensures the survival of the fittest in every department.
Child labor was a particular scandal. In 1900, it was estimated that 80,000 children worked in southern textile mills. Their average work week was 70 hours for a salary of $1 per week. Nationwide, nearly 2 million youngsters were working for as little as 25 cents a day. At the same time, a single party thrown to breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, cost $200,000. As workers fought for a semblance of human dignity and fairness, they took to the streets. Between 1881 and 1906, our nation experienced 38,000 strikes. As for Europe, the situation was, if anything, worse. Centuries of monarchs had developed a class system that deprived ordinary people of land ownership and a voice in government. Industries were in the hands of even fewer people. Voices for change became more and more extreme. American anarchist Emma Goldman.
We urgently call you, the wage-earning class, to arm yourselves in order to be able to put forth against your exploiters such an argument which alone can be effective: violence.
A growing tide of socialists and anarchists demanded the end of private property itself. Karl Marx.
Our ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Working men of all countries, unite.
This was the world faced by Cardinal Gioacchino Pecci when he became Pope Leo XIII in 1878. The same world he faced when he issued an official teaching letter on the condition of workers, entitled Rerum Novarum, 13 years later.
In order to understand the 100 years since Rerum Novarum was written and bring us up to this anniversary year, you really have to go back a little bit before that for a theological context to the First Vatican Council, which was the first truly ecclesiological council that had ever been called. Leo XIII was present at the First Vatican Council as Cardinal Pecci, and he was privy to all the discussions that went on about the nature of the church, the function of the church, the mission of the church in terms of its being understood as the mystical body of Christ. And when he became Pope, it found its way into all of his writings that we as human persons are responsible for each other because we are one body.
While Pope Leo is an innovator in emphasizing the unity of the human race in the mystical body of Christ, he embodied the times in his view of the world. He looked at the world as a threat to eternal salvation, and therefore to be avoided as much as possible. The church he headed, consequently, had difficulty dealing with the intellectual revolutions sweeping Western thought at that time, the revolutions generated by Darwin, Freud, and Marx.
They were threatening for multiple reasons, and instead of investigating them in a sense of research and inquiry, the church battened down the hatches, and it was a kind of a siege mentality.
Under these conditions, Pope Leo's teaching letter on the condition of workers was a remarkable document. In it, the Pope addressed the paramount social and economic issue facing Europe, the rising threat of socialism, in reaction to industry's shameless exploitation of workers. Condemning socialists' cry for a complete overthrow of the social order, Pope Leo first reaffirmed the God-given right of private property. But then he went on to condemn capitalist abuse of that right.
The rich and employers should remember that no laws, either human or divine, permit them for their own profit to oppress the needy and the wretched or to seek gain from another's want.
For the first time, an international figure called for a living wage for all laborers, and he defended the right of workers to organize. The impact of Rerum Novarum when we return.
We know that we're going to keep trying to press and push and see if we can't, in fact, change their mind.
Social turmoil did not suddenly end in 1891. In truth, Pope Leo's defense of workers was probably little heeded in short run. But the publication of Rerum Novarum had at least one major long-term effect. It validated the struggle of workers to organize, as Sister Margaret Cafferty attests.
Well, we come from an Irish immigrant family that arrived in Pennsylvania sometime toward the end of the last century. And there were 9 children in my father's family. All of them went to work when they were 7. The boys went to work in the collieries sorting coal and eventually worked underground. They used the children to locate dynamite because they were tiny and could get into places where grown people couldn't reach. So by the time my father left the mines at 15, he'd already worked for 8 years. Those were hard times. There were strikes, there were depressions, and my family survived, didn't starve to death through that period of time because of 3 forces. The Democratic Party dealt out patronage, and they brought food baskets when things were particularly bad. The United Mine Workers led a battle for unionization that began with the Molly Maguires and finally ended up with one of the first recognized unions in the United States. And through all of that, the Catholic Church told my family that they were right in their struggle to try to organize and to gain some rights for workers. So probably of all of the things that any of those forces did, what the church did was the most important because it gave some moral authority to the struggle, and it gave credibility to people who were very poor and who had very few institutional forces on their side.
The fact is that the presence of church support for the theories of organization and the rights of workers was, I think, decisive at a number of points in the history of the labor movement. And it was the support of members of the hierarchy and priests at the parish level that encouraged a lot of Catholics and a lot of other believing people to see unions in a respectable light and to see them as a natural outlet for people's desire to affect their conditions and improve their lot.
The right to organize has been a principle defended continuously in 100 years of church teaching. Pope John Paul II calls unions an indispensable form of social life in modern industrialized societies, and individual bishops continue to speak out.
Thank you. I will take about 2 minutes.
The most significant contribution at the moment is the willingness of Cardinal O'Connor in New York to associate himself so clearly with the strikers at the Daily News and to express the very firm belief that they are defending their natural law rights in that strike, and to be willing to testify, as he did, before the Senate committee that's considering the striker replacement issue. I think that was a very signal contribution of the church.
Judgment that those who use permanent replacements have the obligation to prove that this is moral and not only legal. To lose collective bargaining process in this country would be to lose unionism. To lose unionism would be to go back to the days that were worse than slavery.
The U.S. hierarchy has long considered it their obligation to try to impact public policy. Today, the National Conference of Catholic Bishops continually addresses social legislation, testifying before congressional committees on a wide range of issues, from civil rights to family medical leave.
Parents should not have to choose between the jobs they need and the children who need them. Mothers and fathers
in the 1980s, A more conservative mood in the nation led to the human service system being described as a safety net. That was a major philosophical political change. Do we remain silent and merely become an ambulance picking up the broken pieces of other people's decisions? We have a role in the moral dialogue of the nation. What kind of a workforce do we want in the future? What kind of quality of life do we want? Let's face it, if you look at how public laws are created, the wealth that is invested in political action committees to get the government to make particular decisions to benefit certain organizations. The poor people just aren't part of the scenario. How many poor people are congressmen or women? How many senators get up and say, I want to tell you how poor I am? We have to keep talking about Abraham Lincoln because we haven't had a poor one for so long.
From economic issues to abortion to nuclear disarmament, the bishops have frequently become a lightning rod when they speak out. Let the bishops stick to religious matters, some object. Leave to Caesar the things that are Caesar's.
It comes down to should American church men and women be barred from politics? I don't know anybody who thinks that should be the case. Whether, in fact, it's Pat Robertson's politics, or it's Jesse Jackson's politics, or Jerry Falwell's politics, or the American bishop's politics. That's what American politics is. It is pluralistic. It is open. We compete with ideas. We compete with values.
This is a big church. We're Democrats and Republicans, we're liberals and conservatives, and everything in between. And our teaching doesn't tell us how to vote or who to vote for. That would be inappropriate. But it does suggest some fundamental values that have to be taken into consideration as we shape our life together. And those are concern for the poor, concern for questions of justice, the pursuit of peace.
Not all the voices in the tradition of Catholic social teaching come from the official church. One independent voice is Nancy Sylvester, a registered lobbyist, a religious sister, and head of an organization called Network.
A network was started in 1971 in sort of an interesting way by 47 Catholic sisters from all different congregations. It was right after the Vatican II. It was a whole new understanding of how to relate to church and to society. And so many women started moving out of traditional ministries. They decided that they were going to take their sense of who they are as citizens and couple it with their faith to say, look, is there a way of changing public policy to alleviate that suffering? They said, okay, yes, there is. We're going to do it. We're going to do it through the political process, and we're going to do it as a faith-based group, and we're going to call ourselves Network. It's a way of trying to persuade, trying to engage in dialogue with the members of Congress in terms of our policy agenda and our position.
How are all you?
When we go to the Hill, we get all different kinds of reception. Because we do a voting record, members of Congress know that we're really there. That's a very critical piece for us because they always like to watch who's watching them, and we watch them. So for those who vote with us, we get a very nice reception. For those who don't always, we may get a more cool reception. I'd have to say, though, there is a sense that we do our homework. They may not all agree with us, but we've been here long enough now to have some credibility. We're going on 20 years. And they know that we're not for ourselves, that we really are trying to argue for those in society who don't have lobbyists and paid lobbyists on the Hill. We're going to keep trying to press and push and see if we can't, in fact, change their minds.
The saddest statistic I know is that how many children die every day, yesterday, today, and tomorrow.
The 1960s. World War II has shrunk the world. It is a smaller, more intense, more interdependent marketplace. The East and West are locked in a Cold War. Nevertheless, optimism is in the air. John F. Kennedy is elected president. Martin Luther King presses for civil rights. John the 23rd has become Pope and throws on the windows of the church, calling for a second Vatican Council. The Catholic Church is at a watershed. Bishops assembled from around the globe express a new worldview. Catholics are asked no longer to avoid this world in pursuit of the next, but to encounter this world and help redeem it.
By the time of Vatican II, this rising, heightened awareness and consciousness of the world had begun to really be part and parcel of what was happening at Vatican Council II. For example, the document Gaudium et Spes specifically, instead of being afraid of what was happening in the world, specifically, consciously, and deliberately addresses itself to the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the persons of this world, and says that those joys, hopes, griefs, and anxieties, everything that's taking place around us in the world, really must be the concern of the church.
It was a very significant document, and I think that it really has changed in a very substantial way our outreach to the world. No longer do we think that for some reason we must escape from the world, that we're totally independent of the world. We're not of the world, as Jesus told us, but we're certainly in the world. And the world, too, was created by God.
The new attitude of the church was immediately apparent. Pope Paul VI was the first pope to travel widely, the first to visit the United States, and the first to visit the United Nations, where he delivered his famous words, "War no more, no more war."
Jamais plus de guerre, jamais plus de guerre.
This new involvement in the affairs of this world proved to be a problem for many Catholics who had grown up with a church focused firmly on the hereafter. The church became polarized between those seeking more relevance and those seeking reliance on tradition, a tension that still exists a generation later. But papal attention was resolutely turned toward issues of this world. Pope John XXIII and his successor, Pope Paul VI, each wrote 2 extensive encyclicals, that is, teaching letters on social issues. These letters embrace the principles of Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, but they also reflect 70 intervening years of change. While continuing to condemn the abuses of capitalism, these more recent popes no longer reject socialism outright. They are less absolute about the right of private property. They reject a totally free economy and call on governments to intervene in the regulation of private property to assure the benefit of all. They go beyond support for unionization to call for an overhaul of unjust economic structures, not only within nations, but between nations. Here in America, race was a major issue of the 1960s. As it polarized the country, it polarized the church. Although the U.S. Catholic bishops, as a group, had spoken out against discrimination as early as 1943 and had published brief statements several times in the 50s and 60s, it wasn't until 1979 that the U.S. bishops issued a national pastoral letter on racism. Bishop Joseph Francis chaired the writing committee.
It said simply that racism is a sin. Institutional racism and individual racism. And then it describes how that is a sin.
Bishop Francis personally looks back with some sorrow for the church, based on his own experience in the early days of the civil rights movement, when perhaps most Catholics thought it was their duty only to go to church and pray.
The Catholic Church had a minimal presence in the civil rights movement. In fact, the bishop of the diocese in which most of the action took place, that would have been in the whole state of Alabama, actually issued orders that the religious priests and others should not come to the diocese to march in solidarity with Dr. Martin Luther King. And of course, most of us who went down and did march simply went down and marched as citizens.
There is another perspective on Catholic involvement in civil rights, however. Ron Jackson is a layman with roots in the Deep South and in the church.
There was a priest in my growing up years who was very influential. Phil McLoone, I never forget one Sunday, just got angry with the congregation. And he said, now look, if you all won't get with me and go register to vote. This was shortly after the Supreme Court had ruled that poll taxes were illegal. And it was tough for people to just willingly and freely go to the county courthouse and register to vote. There was an inherent fear there. So Phil McLoone said, well, if you won't follow me as a priest, and he pulled off his vestment, you follow me as one of you. And that was quite compelling. I mean, here was a white priest in an all-black church and he considered himself as one of us.
Ron Jackson has been involved in civil rights ever since. Today, he is a public policy analyst for the National Urban League.
Right, yeah. Now, what we really need, though, at this point, is to get your House members, particularly, and your senators, as far as that matter is concerned. We've had a change in ideology in this country that is not favorable to what we believe is the majority of the people in this country. How you doing, man? Particularly disadvantaged populations. Unfortunately, the court has removed some rights. And the only way we can restore those rights, as the court said in its opinion, is to go back to the Congress, through the legislative process, and get the laws back on the books that will protect people's individual civil rights.
The inspiration for Ron's life came first from his father, and he has made it a goal to see that his own family is close-knit and prepared to meet today's new challenges. With his wife, Brenda, he has developed a simple code for his children to follow.
The code is really to give them a little structure, give them a whole lot of structure, where that if they focus on these 4 things, love God first, honor thy mother and father, don't use drugs, and get a good education. But, you know, prayerfully, we can help them become good, mature adults that can be contributors to society. So we, I guess like any American family, we have our downfalls, we have our upswings, and the closer we stay to these children, I think the better we'll be able to accomplish what needs to be accomplished.
Inspired by the spirit of the Second Vatican Council and buoyed by newfound affluence, Catholics during the 60s and 70s greatly expanded their charity to the poor. Individual churches, religious priests and sisters, and many others got involved. The efforts of the official church are organized under the banner of Catholic Charities.
I think you could say that Catholic Charities is the most significant source of care for the homeless and hungry in America. We don't brag about that. Most people wouldn't think that. But if you analyze community after community, who's serving those in need? Very often, it's the religious community, certainly, and a big part of that is the Catholic community.
This is the only mobile bus that I've seen with the kitchen on it that actually comes to the people.
You know, we just try and help where we can.
When we were founded, we were really a poor people's movement, a poor people's church. In point of fact today, Catholic Charities system at the local level probably is providing some of the most creative, state-of-the-art services to some of the most hurting populations.
Twisting, twisting, now we are twisting all day long.
Catholic social services are offered by parishes and by dioceses. They are provided by skilled professionals and by a wide variety of volunteers, from school children helping prepare food baskets to doctors providing specialized care to the homeless and indigent. Loving care is given to innocent babies born addicted to drugs or infected with the AIDS virus. Services from meals to medicine are available to the elderly and homebound. New immigrants are welcomed as they start a fresh life with the critical support of secondhand furniture and a smile. And always there is the desire to raise a new generation of responsive and aware adults.
All these statistics, gentlemen, poor people are not statistics. They are real. They got flesh, Robin, right? Like yourself. They feel. Okay?
The saddest statistic I know is that how many children die every day, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And we worry, as we should, about crack babies in this country, about the unborn in this country. But because of economic forces loose in this world, there are children who die every day.
Charity may begin at home, but it doesn't end there. The Church's commitment to human solidarity extends around the globe.
I met today with a bishop from Africa. Talked about the food that the Catholic community in the United States, through Catholic Relief Services, provides, and the difference that makes in keeping people alive.
When the crisis in Iraq and the Persian Gulf caused a sudden and massive influx of refugees, for example, Catholic Relief Services was there to help. While the rest of the world was ignoring the tragedy of starvation in Angola due to war, CRS was there. Because CRS has resident staff in 43 countries and affiliations in 68 countries overall, they are in a position to respond quickly when disaster strikes.
You're keeping people alive and hoping for better conditions to give them a start. But even there, we begin to try to build up the community capability by bringing in seeds and tools and building as much as we can community capability so that you have a stepping stone to something of more permanence.
Long-term help through technical assistance, education, seed money can eventually allow local communities to become self-sufficient. For example, in one part of Honduras, where people spend long hours every day carrying water from remote and contaminated sources, CRS forms partnerships with local communities. The people commit themselves to a 2-year program of health and hygiene education, labor, and a small part of the cost. CRS provides the rest. The result is clean, potable water in every home, which means better health, more productive work, newfound community pride, and self-reliance. In the words of Pope Paul VI, development is the new name for peace. The growth of Catholic social teaching reflects an increasing responsiveness to the complexity of changing times, to a growing awareness that we are all sisters and brothers on a small planet, and to the insight that systems, legal systems, governmental systems, economic systems, are as important as individual actions in creating or defeating hopes and opportunities. The current Pope, John Paul II, has made a major contribution to this tradition. He has taken the occasion of the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum to address his abiding concern for those who suffer as a consequence of economic forces.
Love for others, and in the first place, love for the poor, in whom the Church sees Christ himself, is made concrete in the promotion of justice. For this to happen, it is not enough to draw on the surplus goods, which in fact our world abundantly produces. It requires above all a change of lifestyles, of models of production and consumption, and of the established structures of power which today govern societies.
In his travels to every continent, he has brought his message not only to the powerful and people of goodwill, but directly to the poor. You do not need to live this way, he tells people in the favelas of Brazil. Do not assume that God has said this is appropriate for you. Organize yourselves. Create new systems for yourselves. Here in the U.S., the bishops have written a series of pastoral letters in recent years, applying the principles of church doctrine to specific local circumstances.
Probably the most well-known example of that have been these 2 or 3 major pastorals in the late 70s and early 80s. First of all, pastoral on racism, says racism is a sin, and calls every Christian to do what they can to break down the walls between race and ethnicity. Secondly, a pastoral letter on war and peace in the midst of an arms buildup around the world. And then the third pastoral, in many ways the toughest, I think, looked at what it meant to be a believer in the midst of this powerful economy. What did it mean to be poor in spirit, but also to reach out to the poor when a lot of us weren't poor?
The writing of these pastorals stirred controversy. Many accused the bishops of overstepping their competence. Because they were applying broad theological principles to particular economic realities, the bishops made every effort to consult widely, making early drafts available for public comment.
I'm very proud of the final product, the challenge of peace, God's promise, and our response. However, I think the process that we used was even more valuable than the final product, in the sense that people were talking about the issues.
The bishops voted in 1980 to do the pastoral on the U.S. economy and Catholic social teaching. we decided to look at what the economy did for people's lives and their values, what it did to them, and at the same time, how it permitted people or didn't permit people to participate in the life of the nation. I can say that I spent almost 1 week a month on that letter for 5 years and learned a lot. We had hearings all over the United States from all levels of society. We listened and listened and listened.
Through their consultation process, the bishops were able to have an extended dialogue with both their backers and their critics. Among the latter was writer Michael Novak. He and some other lay Catholics actually responded by writing their own letter.
Lay people have special responsibilities in the area of worldly matters, political economy, social justice. Those areas belong primarily to the lay people, not to the clergy. And we would be delinquent in our responsibilities if we didn't try to address them head on. I think we had a big effect on the discussion. And we were extremely pleased with the way the bishops listened to various options, and when they saw a good point, adopted it, not only from us but from others. The bishops were amazingly open and willing to entertain argument during that period.
Most issues are very complex. There might be a social dimension, there might be an economic dimension, but almost always there is an ethical or moral dimension. And this is why I believe that the church should be part of the public debate, to highlight that particular dimension of the problem or issue.
While the bishops sought the most expert and diverse reactions they could to their document, they did not try to duck tough questions and made bold recommendations for ethical reform of the economy. And even now, the discussion continues.
I admire the men and women in this audience for having the audacity to suggest that there are solutions. And the fact that I'm listening, or you're listening, or that we're all attempting to listen and talk to each other is an extremely important element in finding solutions to some of these very vexing problems that afflict our nation.
The answers come in community. They don't come in isolation.
We can see in the extreme, we're all against war, we're against violence, we're against this, we're against that. But can we see it in ourselves?
While the teachings of popes and bishops can have impact through preaching in the parish and response to immediate needs, the church recognizes this is not enough. It needs to commit itself as well to long-term solutions, to attacking the root causes of problems caused by unfairness and inequity. To accomplish this, they established an innovative program that would offer not a handout, but a hand up. Its goal is to help people get together to solve their own problems. For 20 years now, the Campaign for Human Development has been funding low-income groups who have identified their own needs and provided their own solutions. $150 million and 3,000 funded community groups later, exciting change is happening all over the nation.
The track record of the Campaign for Human Development really, I think, speaks for itself. While it hasn't totally solved the problems of poverty and injustice in our society, it has set in place a methodology, a way to allow this to happen, not from the top down, but really from the bottom up, with the involvement, the participation of the poor, the low income.
A second goal of the campaign addresses the fact that those who are not part of the solution are part of the problem. This means the poor and the non-poor must join together. Bridges need to be built between the poor and the middle class. Common values, interests, and goals need to be found. What better place to begin than in church?
Breaking open of the word. When I heard about the middle income process, I was exhilarated. I saw a tremendous problem in creating an awareness with middle and upper middle income people. They were willing to give their money to an annual collection, but they didn't see how it really connected to their faith.
Stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace be with you."
Parishioners in middle-income parishes are invited to a retreat to reflect on the Gospels and the Church's social teachings. The participants, who continue in a regular prayer group, then ask themselves, what can I do? Barbara Roth is an MIP participant and leader.
In the Diocese of Palm Beach, there's extravagant wealth and there's extravagant poverty, and there's not a meeting of the two. And there's not an awareness that there's an abstract awareness that exists, but not a concrete awareness.
Middle-income participants gain awareness by meeting with low-income communities that are organizing to solve local problems.
Beach organizing project. And I want to know, will this organization take that upon themselves too? Our kids have nowhere to go. They're always out in the street. You know, they have nowhere to go. Nowhere.
The result is plenty of desire to help. The question is, how? This is not always easy. There needs to be trust.
When we went into the community, there was not a lot of trust in, are these just another group of church folks who want to do good, or are they really and truly interested in listening to the problem?
But trust can be achieved. One low-income community in Palm Beach found middle-income people willing to become partners as they organized to address City Hall. Other middle-income participants learned of the efforts of migrant workers to find stable jobs and homes that would enable their children to finish school and escape the cycle of poverty. A group of migrant women had already formed a sewing cooperative with funding from the Campaign for Human Development and welcomed help from the middle-income process. At first, the middle-income partners were able to help financially by buying the cooperative a key piece of equipment. But as the ongoing relationship grew, they were able to offer more long-range help, like marketing advice, suggesting a strategy of selling clerical shirts to priests by direct mail.
We were able to market the product for them just by simply addressing envelopes and doing that in great bulk and number.
Now, I want you to understand that the people here, they all speak Spanish except one. So to write English, it would be very, very difficult for them. Luckily, we did participate in the middle-income process.
There was a real sense of empowerment in the community, and that we were really helping people so much that they were able to put a second shift on.
It's no threat, no nothing. It's one more friend that they have.
The answers come in community. They don't come in isolation.
So this combination of prayer, reflection, and partnership breaks down economic barriers and makes the gospel a reality for both sides. In Palm Beach, what began as one experimental group in one parish has become 7 ongoing groups in several parishes, and the ripple effect continues. Another way to generate long-term solutions is to help assure that all people have a say in the political process. In the early 1970s, a group of low-income parishes in San Antonio joined together to form COPS, Communities Organized for Public Service. COP's current president is Virginia Ramirez.
I always remember that I went to my first meeting, and when I went there, I expected them to solve my problem. I said, well, what are you going to do? And they turned around and told me, well, okay, what are you willing to do? This is your community. What are you, Virginia Ramirez, willing to do? And that's how I got involved in COPS. I realized that if I didn't do it, nobody else was going to do it.
Today, COPS, in coalition with other community organizations, exercises genuine clout in the city of San Antonio. Ernie Cortez was the organizer responsible for COPS.
I'm an organizer, and I teach people how to form broad-based citizens organizations, community organizations, to deal with issues and pressures that affect families. And I teach people how to do politics, non-electoral, nonpartisan politics, but politics in the Greek sense of teaching people how to deal with public issues, how to deal with public relationships, and how to be effective in the public arena. Most people, unless you're very rich and very well connected, don't know how to move the public agenda. It's not a perspective that is taught in the universities.
You can go up, then you're going to come down a bit, and then the last 3 paragraphs you punch up.
Cortez is an effective teacher. Today, he is able to witness a convention of more than 10,000 delegates of organizations like COPS from all over the state of Texas.
When you see the organizations come together, you look at their banners, you look at their leaders, their joy, and you look at their track record, and you know, I had a small part to play in building those organizations. When you see the fruits of that, you know, it kind of makes you feel good. We take institutions that are already there, churches, primarily congregations, temples, Roman Catholic, Black Baptist, Jewish synagogues, Protestant, Presbyterian churches, etc. You take the leaders from those institutions and begin to put them together, enable them to begin to explore meaningful questions. How do you raise children in the 1990s? So what do you do about the fact that we don't have a housing strategy? We've got so many homeless people. What do you do about the massiveness of unemployment among poor people in our community? What do you do about those kind of things?
We are angry, capital A, at the injustice that we still see.
All these organizations across the Southwest have gotten significant assistance from the Campaign for Human Development. CHD understands the iron rule. They'll never do for anybody what they can do for themselves. So they don't give grants to communities unless they're able to come up with local dollars, initially 40%. It's important for people to own these organizations. It's important for them to feel like that those organizations are theirs, they belong to them.
Because of your work, thousands of people have a voice, poor people have a place at the table, and political leaders must consider a new power structure that is more than just business as usual.
One of the purposes of the convention is to challenge political candidates to endorse an agenda approved by the delegates. Candidates from both parties for every state office appeared.
Yes, we will meet after this election. We must consult. We must plan. We must share our collective vision to make Texas a better place for all its citizens.
I enjoy teaching, I enjoy mentoring, and I just feel like, people should not be left out. You can't have a situation where you got a small group of men, making decisions for an entire community and leaving out the vast majority of citizens. I was taught as a young man that God loves justice, mercy. I guess I believed it.
When Leo XIII first wrote Rerum Novarum, his concern was the threat of socialism and industrial labor abuse. With the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the dawn of the post-industrial era, is the task done? What are the challenges of the future?
Well, for a community committed to the defense of the dignity and rights of the human person, there's a big agenda ahead of us. You look around the world, the way millions upon millions of people live in conditions that we would not describe as human. You look at the continuing reality of hunger and homelessness in our own society. So we have a lot to do simply to continue to keep faith with the concerns we've expressed.
I think the biggest challenge is the challenge of the church to call itself and North Americans to a more radical living out of the social teachings of the church and what we call the option for the poor, making God's choice of the poor our own. We as North Americans consume so much of the world's resources, and we're probably characterized by runaway individualism and runaway consumerism. And both of those things are contrary to the social teachings of the church. So I think that we have an enormous challenge to look at our own lifestyle. If we're going to live in a very small, fragile planet at peace with our neighbors, then I think we're going to have to look at both of those things and apply the social teachings of the church to them.
We're believers in resurrection. If I want to fixate on the problem, I'm fixating on Good Friday. Man, I like to fixate on Easter. It looked like Jesus was losing. But something was born that gave people that wanted to embrace it a dream that even death was not stronger than the life he was promising. And I got to believe any evil that's limiting the human capacity to grow and to live is not stronger than that power. Many days I'm discouraged, but every day I say I believe, and I still trust that that presence is going to guide us.